This presentation is on multicultural education. This is the presentation that I give to my undergraduate teacher education students, and the course is Social and Multicultural Foundations of Education. This slide shows the history of multicultural education. It started in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, and could be referred to as the early ethnic studies movement. People were always looking for ways to be educated, but not everyone didn't always have access to education. And for people who were enslaved, it was actually a crime for them to be educated or to educate them. Nevertheless, there were separate schools for African Americans and German immigrants that began. And we call these ethnic enclaves. The idea is to educate our own, to distinguish the self-selection and self-segregation of choices, more so for the German immigrants than the African Americans, but you'll also come across some sentiment from African American leaders who saw that integrating the schools or allowing African American students to be taught by white teachers was a great disservice to them, and in fact, having them exposed just to the white Eurocentric curriculum created a deep sense of inferiority. So there are still some people who believe that separate may be better. But after World War II, you have a general movement called the intergroup education movement. And here you have a widespread recognition that people in the U.S. need to be able to communicate to people from outside of the U.S. who don't speak English. And so there was an interest in learning the languages and cultures of other people, and in particular it was for commerce and the opening up of markets in the East, in the eastern part of Europe, and then in Asia as well as some parts of Africa. Then in the 60s and 70s, along with the other social movements, you have the ethnic studies movement. And this involved claims for civil rights and cultural recognition. It aimed to change inequities in the social system. So it was the idea that groups of people, say Native Americans, were not hearing their history and representation of their people fairly portrayed in the common curriculum. And so there was an agitation for separate studies for these groups, which developed into multicultural education as one of the versions we know it today. Early on, ethnic studies, for example, Arab American studies, Asian American studies, African American studies, Native American studies. So this idea of concentrating on groups of people that have traditionally been marginalized in the core curriculums of K-12 and in higher ed. Also a part of this from, I would say, the 90s onward is cultural studies, which is the idea of studying multi-groups and intersections among groups. So you might have an interest in Chicana feminists or black lesbians, or just the idea of studying the effects of the combination of poverty and ethnic marginalization. Cultural studies sometimes also includes women and gender studies, or women and gender studies might be by themselves. You might often also see queer studies, which is not an impolite term anymore. In fact, queer is a more inclusive term that refers to all kinds of gender expression and sexual orientation. And then finally, more recently, you've got masculinity studies, which is a critical look at how the dominant violent masculinity in the US and other Western countries actually disserves both men and women. So we actually have the Center for Men and Masculinity Studies as part of our department. And then hyperlinked here for you is whiteness studies, which surprises people, but investigates the construction of this thing called whiteness out of different European ethnicities. Too often in education, students are taught or think of ethnicity as something that other people, other non-white people have. So this is again, a critical look at confronting white European descendant people's own ethnic background and makeup, and that construction of whiteness and what whiteness means. This slide shows the characteristics of multicultural education by Sonia Nieto, and it's hyperlinked for you so that you can read about the work of this education scholar. So in this course and in writing and teaching about multicultural education, I take definitions from Sonia Nieto and from James Banks. Sonia Nieto's 7 characteristics involve multicultural education as an entire view, an entire worldview, not a separate class. So you have multicultural education as anti-racist education. That means it's not just about food, fun, and faces and a celebration of diversity, but actually a position that is anti-discriminatory, anti-oppressive. It's basic education, meaning that it's not add-on for people who need more work. It's not an elective. It's not properly something that's thought of as fluff or extra. It should be something that is part of the core education for everyone. And related to that is that it's important for all students, not just ethnic minority students, and some would argue that it's more valuable actually for dominant status students because they are not ever forced to think about people who aren't part of the dominant status groups. It should be pervasive. That means not just part of one class, throughout the curriculum and throughout all levels of education. It is education for social justice, so the aim is actually changing the system, not just understanding the inequities in it. Education, multicultural education is a process, so it's something that's ongoing. It's not a checkoff list. It's not one component to add and say we've done multicultural education, we're finished with it. It's an ongoing process of development through curriculum study, through uncovering of biases, through changing of attitudes, and all aimed at changing oppressive social systems. And finally, it's critical pedagogy, and you might recall this from Freire and Giroux, the idea that multicultural education encourages students to ask questions about inequalities that they observe. And this slide continues Nieto's definition of multicultural education. At the bottom, you can see the resource if you want to read the entire thing. It's a process of comprehensive school reform and basic education for all students, which challenges and rejects racism and other forms of discrimination in schools and society, accepts and affirms the pluralism, ethnic, racial, linguistic, religious, economic, gender, among others, that students, their communities, and teachers reflect, and permeates the school's curriculum and instructional strategies, as well as the interactions among teachers, students, and families, and the very way that schools conceptualize the nature of teaching and learning. James Banks is the other scholar that I use in talking about multicultural education. James Banks is probably the one person most responsible for the multicultural education curriculum and research in higher ed as a subdiscipline of education studies. The work that I reference most of the time and that I share with students is the Handbook of Research on Multicultural Education, and James Banks and Sherry Banks are the editors. This is hyperlinked so that you can find out more information about all 5 processes, the 5 dimensions of multicultural education: content integration, the knowledge construction process, prejudice reduction, and equity pedagogy, and empowering school culture and social structure. And these are developmental too. James Banks says that teachers who are just starting out might begin with integrating content about people other than those in the mainstream, but it should never stop there. It should develop into a whole school-wide and community change in structure, and that's where it is similar with Sonia Nieto's idea of multicultural education. And here is James Banks' definition of multicultural education: a field of study or pedagogy and an educational practice whose major aim is to create equal educational opportunities for students from diverse racial, ethnic, social class, and cultural groups, including religious groups and LGBT students, to give male and female students an equal chance to educational success and mobility, to help all students to acquire the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary to function effectively in a pluralistic democratic society, and to interact with peoples from diverse groups. So note Banks's particular emphasis on pluralistic democratic society. Pluralism means that there are distinct and separate groups that have equal status in a society and that interact independently. It's the opposite from the idea of assimilation, which means that a democratic society invites different kinds of people in as long as they convert or change to an identity that is acceptable to the dominant status group. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when we had waves of immigration into the United States, the dominant view was assimilation, that everyone would become Americans, and what that meant is that everyone would conform to what was acceptable of the dominant status group, which were white Northern European Christian people in particular. The first step of James Banks' model for multicultural education is content integration, which is the extent to which teachers use examples from a variety of cultures and groups to illustrate key concepts. Examples of content integration in literature would include fairy tales from around the world. An example here is Cinderella. Maybe you didn't know that Cinderella was a global tale. You can choose novels or short stories about the lives of students from different backgrounds. You may need to read these and then add to the conversation. Lists from Goodreads here have mostly juvenile, but some adult fiction and nonfiction. And then there's a list of children's literature from the Department of Education at UW-Madison. Content integration in science class might involve topics such as environmental justice or environmental racism, and this is hyperlinked for more information for you. View and discuss Vivian Thomas, the Blue Baby team from Johns Hopkins. Vivian Thomas was an African-American man who wasn't allowed to study at Johns Hopkins, and this was in the 1930s, I believe, but yet he, working with a white doctor, he was actually a lab assistant for a white doctor, and this white doctor helped him to get recognized for finding the reason and then the cure for blue baby syndrome, which was a heart defect in newborns. You might teach the history of women in science, and there is a collection hyperlinked for you there, or start a science club for girls, again, hyperlinked, so you can find out more information there. Most of these are aimed at K-12 interventions, but also appropriate for especially undergraduate in higher ed. Content integration in a math class might include mentioning Arab culture and mathematics, especially the concept of zero, Egyptian engineering, critical mathematics, for example, calculating the poverty rate among racial and ethnic groups, or teaching students how to read statistics and ask questions. And if you want more information and resources, then check out Marilyn Frankenstein, who is responsible for writing about the Freirean foundations of critical mathematics. Content integration in physical education could include games from around the world, and here is a hyperlink from UNICEF. Yoga and meditation, which has roots in both Western and non-Western cultures. The National Coalition on Racism in Sports and Media helps you to start conversations about the mascots for certain sports teams that are insulting, especially to Native Americans. Gender equality in sport and recreation, non-competitive games, or the Special Olympics. The second dimension for Banks's multicultural education is the knowledge construction process, and this actually has 4 levels. At level 1, you've got the contributions approach, which are heroes, holidays, food, and music, and this is where a lot of multicultural education stops, mostly because people think that this is what it means, this is all it takes, or teachers are reluctant to go further because they don't have the information to take on some of the issues of discrimination. But more likely, it's the belief that multicultural education is about celebrating diversity. At level 2, you have the additive approach, which means adding content to an existent curriculum. For example, adding on a unit of Native Americans, perhaps around Thanksgiving or Columbus Day, as a counterbalance to the dominant narrative of Western colonization. At level 3, you've got the transformation approach, which includes the structure of the curriculum, which is changed, and the focus shifts from one dominant culture to a plurality of cultures. Multicultural texts and activities are used in every class. And then at level 4, the social action approach, you've got teachers raising critical social issues and students working to make change. And we think of this as service learning in most cases. The third dimension of Banks multicultural education is an equity pedagogy. Teachers modify their teaching in ways that facilitate the academic achievement of students from diverse cultural groups. We sometimes call this culturally responsive pedagogy, and I've linked to several YouTube videos by Geneva Gay, who talks about this idea of culturally responsive teaching. It includes using multiple teaching styles and using more cooperative learning arrangements. Students from different racial and ethnic groups must feel that they have equal status in intergroup interactions. Teachers and administrators must value and support cross-racial interactions, and students from different racial groups must work together in teams to pursue common goals. This includes attending to group preferences in learning and demonstrating learning. One of the best examples is that when white teachers go in to teach Native American groups, they're sometimes frustrated at the reticence of some students to individually volunteer answers or take initiative, and they are wrongly labeled as disengaged or even lazy. But a cultural commonality among a lot of Native groups is to learn by watching adults and to learn through groups and to respond in conversation with groups. For some Asian cultures, this might go further to a norm of deference to authority by age, and also the idea of not drawing attention to oneself, not claiming any praise for oneself. So group learning modalities can address these different cultural norms. And of course, if a child is growing up in the U.S. and going through the U.S. school system, they will at some point adopt the norms of the dominant society. But remember, the idea of pluralistic democracy is to allow groups to coexist without requiring them to conform to the dominant norms. The fourth component of James Banks' multicultural education is prejudice reduction, and this happens through anti-racist pedagogy, which is similar for anti-sexist or anti-heterosexist. Beth Barella calls it anti-oppressive pedagogy. There is no such thing as race, meaning a biological difference between people, except that there is, which is the sociological phenomenon. And this comes from Race, the Power of an Illusion, and it's hyperlinked there for you. It's a video series and also some online resources, including quizzes about our misconceptions about race. Ask students to uncover their own prejudices and biases through dialogic journals and social location papers. This is what I use in my own classroom. Explain institutional racism as opposed to racist beliefs and discriminatory actions of individuals. So Beverly Tatum conceived of active racists, passive racists, and active anti-racists as the difference in people's actions and behaviors and choices who are living in a racist society. So you do have people, individuals who are actively racist, so they have negative beliefs about non-white groups, and they actively work to suppress their rights and keep them apart from the mainstream. You have passive racists who maybe are aware of inequalities but don't participate in them actively and choose not to engage on these issues. And then you have active anti-racists who recognize inequality and take steps to make things more fair. And the first step there, being an anti-racist, is acknowledging racism as a systemic reality and speaking out against it. Introducing the concept of white privilege and the history of becoming white, or the construction of whiteness, that white has nothing to do with any particular reality about biology or even skin color, but it is a political category that was constructed to ensure the privileges of the dominant group in early U.S. society. And you'll find writings about the idea of race and the idea of being white from unfortunately from the founders of the country. This idea of white helped people to distinguish the African American slaves from other poor and working class people and indentured servants. And it was a way to coalesce power economically and with the European descendants, and to ensure a generational system of slavery based on ethnicity or perceived race. Introduce white students to successful white allies, such as Tim Wise, a white guy who talks about his own privilege, and it's kind of an aggressive, in-your-face kind of way that is off-putting to some people, or very inspirational and attractive to other people. And connect all the structures of oppression. So the white privilege is connected to gender privilege, which is connected to Christian privilege, which is connected to hetero privilege, and ability privilege. And the work there is from Heather Hackman, and a hyperlink to her information. And the fifth dimension of Banks's multicultural education is an empowering school culture. Examines the grouping and labeling practices, sports participation, and the interaction of students and staff to create an empowering school culture for diverse groups of students. So here, multicultural education is coming out of the curriculum and even out of the individual classrooms. Examples: diversity goals for hiring, our process-oriented and goal-oriented affirmative action steps, anything but quotas. Representation on student councils of gender, sexual, religious, racial minorities, ability minorities. Good relations with all groups in all communities. Allies for LGBT students and staff. Conscious choice of school events to highlight the contribution of marginalized groups in the community. And school service projects that serve the community. I want to add another item here, Gloria Latson-Billings, which is hyperlinked here, so you can check out the work of this educator and her idea of culturally relevant pedagogy. Also hyperlinked to an article that she wrote about this idea. It's a pedagogy of opposition, not unlike critical pedagogy, but specifically committed to collective, not merely individual empowerment. Culturally relevant pedagogy rests on 3 criteria or propositions. Students must experience academic success, students must develop and or maintain cultural competence, and students must develop a critical consciousness through which they challenge the status quo of the current social order. These are the criteria by which a culturally relevant pedagogy would be evaluated. So where there is merely celebration of diversity, yet different non-dominant groups are suffering academically or emotionally or behaviorally, we can't consider that culturally relevant pedagogy. And finally, moving on to the concept for the corresponding chapter in Notting's text, Cosmopolitanism. This is corresponding to multicultural education, a perspective that regards the whole world as a focus for citizenship and mutual concern. The aim of multicultural education is to produce people with cosmopolitan attitudes, to be at home anywhere in the world, which is contrary to nationalism. It's a secularism, which is contrary to religious sectarianism. Advantages of cosmopolitanism, and this comes from Martha Nussbaum: learning more about ourselves, solving international problems, recognizing moral obligations to the rest of the world, learning to make sound arrangements that depend on distinctions other than national identity, and all shared by multiculturalists. Criticisms of cosmopolitanism from Benjamin Barber include the lack of emotional impact, and it's not necessary because it's built into the American ideal, not to be confused with American exceptionalism, which says that the Western European white Christian foundation of American democracy is an ideal system and one that should be preferred and spread around the world. And finally, the educator's dilemma: whether to teach cosmopolitanism or patriotism. Here the idea or the suggestion is to avoid exceptionalism, that idea of America as the most unique and best civilization and the one rightly destined to rule the world. Notting suggests a chastened patriotism, celebrating national identity but recognizing faults and mistakes, trying to see the world from a non-U.S. perspective, and taking rightful pride in founding documents and principles while acknowledging failures to meet them.